Does the electric guitar player need to be loud?
Yes.
Guitarristas, estamos aún en Guitar Summit 2024 en Mannheim y volvemos a ser afortunados porque tenemos con nosotros al gran guitarrista, Chris Buck. Chris, how are you?
I'm very good. Lo siento, no hablo español. Sorry.
That sounded good, actually.
That's about as much as I know, so that's good. That's good.
You just finished a show that was very particular.
Very strange. It was the first show of that kind that I've ever done. It was a silent stage, so it kind of felt like doing a silent disco, but less fun, I guess. Everyone had headphones on. I had headphones on, so it was interesting. But yeah, it went well. People asked questions, which is always very helpful in that scenario, because if people leave me just to talk for 45 minutes, I don't know where it's going to end up. So it was good fun, though.
Which leads me to the question, does the electric guitar player need to be loud?
Yes. I think it's interesting, actually. I think I was born in 1991, and I'm kind of a generation which sort of has one foot in each camp, so to speak, because I grew up, I had a Marshall 4x12 in my bedroom, which I imagine my neighbors as a kid absolutely loved. You know, I was very much, I used to play in pubs and clubs locally, and I was loud, and I was kind of, rock and roll. But then from about the age of about, I don't know, 17, 18 onwards, started discovering things like Guitar Rig and, kind of amp sims and software and stuff like that and plugins. That totally kind of blew my mind initially that a guitar sound could come from somewhere other than an amp or other than a pedal. So how is this lives entirely in my computer? That blew my mind. And I've been fairly pragmatic in that respect, in that a lot of the stuff I've done uses amp sims, it uses a Helix, it uses all of these kind of various ways of making noise. So I'm kind of quite pragmatic in that sense. And like I said, I guess I'm of a generation which kind of understands both. I've done a couple of clinics and masterclasses with younger people now, guys in their late teens, early 20s, who almost seem a little scared of the idea of plugging into a Marshall, plugging into a full stack and kind of turning it up. Because they've never done it. They've never had cause to do that because everything is Helix, everything's neural, everything's this kind of sort of hybrid world, So it's interesting, but I'm a little bit old school. I'm a little bit of a dinosaur in that respect, in that I kind of like loud valve amps, I like, and if not valve amps, I like being loud on stage. So when I play with the Helix live, I use a power cab because it's nice to have a little bit of volume. It's nice for this feedback loop to be there and kind of interplay with the volume that you have. So doing something like that entirely on headphones is a little bit alien to me, but we got through it.
It's funny how you mentioned that the newer generations are afraid of plugging into a Marshall in a way. Do you think we're at the risk of losing the knowledge of how to mic an amp, losing the knowledge of how to squeeze the sound out of a tube amp?
I think so. I think obviously the further down that road it goes that, the Helix or whatever it is the norm. I guess there is a risk that you will lose not necessarily the knowledge of how to mic stuff up, but definitely the knowledge of how to get the best out of those things. If you've never played a 100-watt amp, it's such a physical experience of feeling it hit you, feeling it rattle your bones, and kind of it's an experience that is like no other, even compared to running the Helix into a power cab and turning the power cab up, even that isn't comparable, running a kind of a non-master volume Marshall from the late 60s or whatever, kind of cranking it through a 4x12 or whatever amp it is, it's a Fender Twin, whatever it is, turning an old amp up like that is an experience like no other. And I think even if that's not entirely practical for 99% of applications these days, it's worth at least having done that and understanding that. Because ultimately we're in this kind of slightly bizarre paradox where all of this incredible technology, like the Helix, all of this DSP, all of this computing power is being used at the moment to recreate antiquated, old, vintage technology. Tubes, valves, things that are kind of obsolete for the most part in everyday life. Aside from guitar amps, you don't really come across valves anymore. It's kind of very specific to the guitar industry, So it's this strange paradox of, I think the future of digital technology in that respect probably has a much broader scope than just, let's see how close we can make this chip sound to a twin, or sound to a JCM 800, or whatever it is. I think there's a bigger future in it, but for the time being, we're in this kind of strange realm of let's make it sound like an old amp.
I'm curious about how do you approach the use of Helix, for instance. Do you use it like with memories and presets, or you use it like an amp? Like you just dial a sound that might be different from yesterday.
Okay, yeah. It depends what I'm using it for. I guess for things like today, obviously that's a less than ideal scenario in terms of no sound check really, no real chance to kind of dial things in or, get used to it. And in that respect, presets are incredibly helpful just because I dial up my preset that I use at home and away you go. At least it sounds somewhat similar to what you were used to. I've used Helix in certain scenarios where I've actually used my pedal board as well as the Helix, at which point you essentially use it as an amp. You just dial in the amp sound, dial in the reverb, whatever you would ordinarily use as part of your amp, and then run the pedal board into the front of the Helix in essence. But I think the beauty of the Helix is obviously this, multiple foot switches. You can what I've done with my Helix preset is kind of recreate my full rig. So it's kind of recreating my pedal board and my amp all in one concise little unit, which is great for stuff like this, great for stuff, like fly dates where you're in and out of a country, saves you renting backline, it saves you carting your big old pedal board around the place, so it's very helpful.
Absolutely. Speaking of which, you just made a few dates with your band, but you have a UK tour.
Yeah,
coming
so
soon.
we've been out in the US, summer just gone, we'll be probably back out in the US next summer. I don't know whether I was meant to say that yet. But we have a UK tour coming up as well. We're out in Europe at the end of the year with Miles Kennedy. So there's a lot going on. There'll be a new album coming out next year as well. So the next couple of months are going to be incredibly busy.
How was the show at the Troubadour?
Yeah, it was amazing. It was, I think I'd kind of built that up in my head to be something that it was possibly never going to be. I'd kind of dreamt of that venue since watching kind of bootlegs of Guns N' Roses playing there in '86 or whatever, these grainy footage of this iconic band in this iconic venue that, unless I got up on stage at the Troubadour and it was like playing Madison Square Garden, I think it was always going to be a slight kind of, not anticlimax, but a bit of a kind of underwhelming moment. But it was brilliant. The crowd were incredible. It was sold out as well, which, kind of blew our minds that we traveled 6,000 miles across the Atlantic and all of these people wanted to turn up and see us. It was incredible. The entire US run was brilliant, actually. So we're excited to go back.
I love the fact that you approach it as a band, as opposed to some people who say that like soloist or individual artists are the thing to go now.
Funnily enough, before we launched Cardinal Black, we had a conversation about that. Obviously, I'd been doing the YouTube thing for a while, kind of developing this following on YouTube, developing this following on Instagram, etc., etc. And it was definitely a conversation we had early on, where the guys in the band, to be fair to them, kind of said, do you want it to be Chris Buck and the Bellends was actually the name suggested as a joke, but thankfully we stayed away from that. But it was kind of broached as an idea that it could almost be a solo project, with a different singer. I didn't want to do that in the slightest. I'm a band guy. All of my influences, all of my favourite musicians for the most part have been part of bands. They've been kind of part of the writing partnership, or they've been part of the 4-piece, 5-piece band. That's kind of what my background is, and that's what I wanted. So as much as, undoubtedly there are people who turn up to see me play guitar, I'm aware of that. It was very encouraging to see that, you go, like I said, 5,000 miles over the Atlantic, you turn up in Nashville, and people are singing your songs at you, people are singing the words back to you of songs that in your head exist just on, just on Spotify or just, in your car or whatever, you turn up and there's people singing these songs back at you, and you don't really get that with solos. So it's nice to have that with songs, and a band.
Do you have an opinion on the difference of how Americans, United States people live the blues as a music and people in UK?
I think American audiences are definitely different to the UK, a lot more enthusiastic. I think it's maybe a British trait, I guess, to be a little bit more reserved and a little bit kind of quieter, maybe, and not as openly enthusiastic. American crowds were just. The Nashville show was a great example of that. From the moment we walked on stage, it was just wild. It was like playing a rodeo or something. It was amazing. Just such a kind of vibrant, electric atmosphere. I don't think you would necessarily get that in other parts of the world, But it's cool to. it varies from city to city across Europe, across the UK. We toured Germany and Austria and Switzerland last year. Even going, kind of Germany's a fairly big country, but it's still one country. Going from a city like Munich in the south and comparing that to something like Hamburg in the north, vastly different crowds to play to, different response, different way of reacting and interacting with the music. Same in the UK, northern crowds tend to be a little bit more kind of boisterous and rowdy and rock and roll, and then southern crowds are a little bit more kind of reserved. It's interesting to see how it varies from city to city, but so the US, obviously such a big place, I guess it's hard to draw these sweeping generalizations, but it was a lot of fun because the crowds were so different.
Also, before the interview, we were joking about the differences in different parts of Spain.
Yeah.
And you had a gig in Plasencia.
Yeah.
What happened there?
I did a tour with a band years ago called Buffalo Summer, friends from back home in South Wales, who the guitar player couldn't make the tour at relatively last minute. So I jumped in and jumped on tour with them. And clearly, whoever organised the tour didn't own a map of Spain. I think the shortest drive on the tour was about 6 hours. So it was just bouncing all over your beautiful country with no rhyme or reason as to where the next venue was. And we came very close to all of these incredible cities, but without ever actually seeing the city itself. We'd be in an industrial estate just outside Madrid or just outside Valencia or just outside, wherever. But we did a show in Plasencia, and obviously, it's a kind of typically Spanish thing. I guess that shows go on a little bit later generally. So in the UK, stage time for the headline band is usually 9 p.m, give or take. It wasn't uncommon for us to be going on 10:30 some nights, maybe even 11 in some cases, and going through till like 1 in the morning. And we kind of got quite used to this. And this was about 3/4 of the way through the tour, I guess, that we played Plasencia. And I seem to remember that the venue had a restaurant that they owned down the road, or some kind of connection with this restaurant. And they sent us for a beautiful, massive 3-course meal. And we finished the 3-course meal, looked at our watches. We're like, 8:45, we've probably got, kind of an hour and a half now to kind of let that go down. So we walk out of the restaurant, and the venue owner is running down the street in a kind of panic, saying, you were on at 8:30. So we run up, we'd sound checked, thankfully, kind of grab our stuff, on we go. And I've never been sick in my mouth on stage before, but it happened about 3 times in the first song. So that was an experience to remember. It's not very often you spend a gig trying to digest. So memorable for all of the wrong reasons, that particular show. But the rest of the tour was amazing. So we're hoping to come to Spain with Cardinal Black sooner than later. So.
Chris, you have a huge talent on many areas, and I'd like you to give us an advice for the music and another one for the business part.
Kind of got asked a similar question then when I did the clinic. The advice for music, I guess, I don't know, I'm probably the worst person in the world to be giving advice because I'm constantly making mistakes. I'm constantly falling into all of the traps which people have fallen into before me, so I should have learned my lessons by now. I love what I do, and I think that helps me kind of through a lot of scenarios which would probably knock the wind out of my sails, for want of a better phrase, whether it's, kind of tours that you thought were going to go better than they did, or kind of, we played the Royal Albert Hall in London with Peter Frampton, and it was amazing. And on those 3 dates on that tour, I think we lost about £6,000 maybe, because it's just expensive to go out as a touring band. Touring, as support bands don't really get paid much, so you have to kind of absorb those costs, and if I didn't really love what I do, I wouldn't be doing it, because that would depress the hell out of me. In regard to the business side, one thing that we agreed very early on as a band was that someone only comes into our team or into the fold if they offer something tangible. If they offer something where we can see this is what you offer and you do that better than anyone else we know or anyone else that is willing to do it at this point. So it's quite a small team. It's essentially me and Tom, the singer in the band, kind of manage the band on a day-to-day basis. We have a manager, Cedric, who kind of oversees the band. And that's kind of it at the moment. Everything else is done in-house. I do all of the design, all of the kind of content creation, all of the website management, all of that kind of stuff. Our merch is fulfilled by Greg, our keys player, by his wife. And Greg is Tom's brother. So it's all kind of in-house. So every part of the band is managed in-house, which is great for the moment and means that it makes it a little bit more viable as a small business because all of the money comes back into the band, helps sustain us and helps sustain the projects that we're trying to take on next. That probably won't be viable in the long run. You know, Yvette, our merch girl, probably isn't going to be able to fulfill thousands of orders, you know, hopefully at some point. So we might have to look at something else. But the longer you can keep it under control yourself, you will have a much better understanding of the business side of it and what it takes to run a band and what it takes to run a small business. That's all we are, is a small business. It just happens to be that business is playing rock and roll and it's not fixing toilets or it's not, you know, kind of whatever it is, you know, any small business, it's just playing in a band. And you have to take all of the measures in which small businesses have to take in order to survive, in order to try and be profitable. So that would be my advice. As long as you can, keep things in-house. You'll have a better understanding of how it all works. So when a third party does come in, you'll know if they're taking the piss. You'll know if they're taking you for a ride or they're charging you too much or they're not doing their job properly. But for the short term, you'll be able to make more money to survive.
I usually make this question at the end of my interviews, and this was by far one of the best answers ever. So thank you.
Thank you, man. Thank you
very
very much.
helpful.
Well, thank you for interviewing
Straight
me.
to the point.
That was a lot of fun, and I promise next time we speak, I will have learned at least a little bit of terrible Spanish. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Real pleasure.
Absolute pleasure, man. Thank you very much for having me.